in order to invest in high tech. And that investment in high tech means a scarcity of capital and pushes up interest rates on all kinds of assets. But until the dot-com boom starts in 1994, the big news, the big events, are all that the interest rates on long-term U.S. government bonds are falling, and are falling steeply, as people look at the future and say, in the future the government budget deficit is going to be much smaller, and the future government spending is going to be smaller than we had projected, and so real interest rates need to be lower. That's how it happened. That's not how it's happening now. There are no signs of such a channel at work here and now. And indeed, there is, however, a somewhat more subtle argument. An argument not just that cutting government purchases doesn't help and expanding government purchases doesn't hurt, or that cutting government purchases doesn't hurt and expanding government purchases doesn't help an economy going to have higher employment and production in the short run. But that argues that you generally want to cut government purchases, not just to crowd in investment and raise your rate of long-term economic growth, but also because if you cut government purchases now, you'll actually find yourself with lower unemployment and higher production now. And this more subtle argument goes more or less like this, that suppose you have a natural rate of unemployment of 5%, and a Phillips curve parameter of 1/2, an inflation target of 2% per year. And suppose people think that there's, say, 90% chance inflation will be 2% per year, a 10% chance inflation will be 12% per year. Let me see, are these numbers going to work? No, let's change it. I want inflation expectations of 4% per year. So let's make it a 20% chance that an 80% chance that inflation will be 2% per year, and a 20% chance that public finances will collapse, that people will stop buying U.S. Treasury bonds, that the Federal Reserve will have to start printing money so that on a very large scale, so that the U.S. government can continue to function. And so people are unsure whether next year and thereafter you'll be in an economy with 2% per year inflation, or you'll be in an economy where inflation has jumped to 12% per year. And that means that inflation expectations on average in your economy are going to be that next year the inflation rate will be something like 4% per year. Then you have a natural rate of unemployment of 5%. You have a Phillips curve slope parameter of 1/2. You have an inflation target of 2% per year. The Federal Reserve hasn't changed its inflation target. And expected inflation is 4% per year, because people look at the large budget deficit and they say there's a 20% chance that this Federal Reserve is going to abandon its inflation target and simply throw in the towel. So that means that if the Federal Reserve is going to hit its inflation target, it's going to have an unemployment rate. No, not of 6%. To put a Phillips curve parameter of 1/2 rather than of 2. You got to push the inflation rate, the unemployment rate, much, much higher. To hit an inflation rate of 2% when expected inflation is 4%, you're going to need an unemployment rate of 9%, just in order to keep the economy, to keep inflation from breaking out on the upside. Now, suppose then that you can cut back government purchases, or you can increase tax rates and eliminate the fear that the finances of the government will collapse, and eliminate the possibility of a jump to 12% inflation. Well, then, if you have this 20% chance, that people perceive that inflation will jump, if you manage to eliminate that by making people confident that you won't have any chance of the Federal Reserve abandoning its inflation target, well, then inflation expectations will drop down to 2% per year, and then you can hit your inflation target with an unemployment rate of 5%, which by Oken's law will mean that your real GDP is 8% higher than it was when your unemployment rate of 9% was needed to hit your 2% per year inflation target. That's the more subtle argument, right, that we're in that situation. So cutting government purchases can then be expansionary. If the Federal Reserve is hitting its unemployment rate target in order to hit its inflation target, if fiscal austerity will make households, firms, and investors confident that inflation will not jump, if households, investors, and firms were scared that inflation was going to jump beforehand, and if the Federal Reserve notices and responds to this, then in this case, it's fiscal austerity as a way of calming markets that fear a sudden outburst of inflation. And because they fear a sudden outburst of inflation, high unemployment, high interest rates, and slack demand are needed to keep inflation relatively low. This is another argument for expansionary fiscal contraction. And indeed, you can make this argument for the mid-1990s, and indeed we did, back when we worked for the Clinton administration, arguing for the actual implementation in early 1993 of the plans that had been proposed to reduce the government budget deficit, and so reduce the chance that the Federal Reserve would abandon its commitment to low inflation. And indeed, those policies are widely characterized as having been highly successful. Although, truth to tell, the success of the economy during the Clinton years probably owes 30% to the deficit reduction policies that had been put in place between 1990 and 1993, and owed 70% to the fact that Silicon Valley came along. Right, that just at that moment we had changes and an acceleration in computer and communications technologies. And so the underlying dynamic of invention, innovation, and technology produced a big boom. You can argue that without this fall in interest rates, it really wouldn't have been worth much of anyone's while to invest in high tech in any huge amount. That with an inflation rate of 3%, you have a 6% per year real interest rate back in 1990. You only have a 3% real interest rate come the end of 1993. That having of the real interest rate on long-term investments has to make investing for the future a lot more profitable, which means you're a lot more willing to buy the products of Silicon Valley, which means that research and development to improve the products of Silicon Valley is much, much more profitable. You can argue that those two things are linked, and that argument has, I think, some truth. How much truth, I'm not really sure. But we see expansionary fiscal contraction in the mid-1990s, and we see it in the form of a sharp and steep fall in interest rates on long-term U.S. government bonds when that reduction in spending and increase in taxes hits the economy. We don't see that here and now. We really don't see that. So, I think the last word on expansionary fiscal contraction today was given last Thursday night at the conference in New Hampshire that I went to. Although, alas, I did not see this moment. I was stuck in Philadelphia Airport, sitting in a middle seat of a U.S. Airjet whose engines wouldn't start. And so eventually, after the engine not starting, and after neither of the start parts that they brought up to start the engine working, they bundled us off and over to another airplane. And so I got to Bretton Woods, New Hampshire, to the conference at something like 3 a.m. instead of the 7 p.m. or so that I was supposed to get there. But what I missed was seeing former Treasury Secretary and former Obama administration principal economic advisor Lawrence Summers being baited by reporter Martin Wolf of the Financial Times about whether Larry would like to call the Brito-European austerity policy, saying we're going to cut government spending right now and that's going to make production and employment higher, whether it was nuts. And Larry promptly goes into econo-speak. Passive voice, lots of subordinate clauses, consequences that are likely to be very serious, important to distinguish, questions about how large a subsidy, the involvement of set of issues. It's nearly incomprehensible. We can translate that paragraph of Larry's into, I think, 4 sentences. Yes, I'm trying to be polite. Yes, it is nuts. Europe is likely to fall back into recession as a cause of these policies. That's what the consequences are likely to be very serious for the countries involved means. And then he goes on, talking, once again, in econo-speak, for another paragraph. And I think the translation is twofold. First, if interest rates on Treasury debt are zero, you can't have falling interest rates on Treasury debt to reduce the cost of borrowing to private agents that will crowd in government spending. And if there are no signs that there are any expectations of rising inflation, you can't reduce the fear that inflation might rise because it isn't there. You can't get that rate below zero either. And that's why he says that this appears to be a very high-order gamble, is not one I would be prepared to bet on. And then he goes further and says, I might be wrong. But he goes on to say, if I am wrong, I will be very embarrassed. And then there's this, after this quite contrite about the seriousness of the misjudgments I'm making, there is this convoluted 2 sentences, basically about, you know how much I hate being embarrassed. So draw your own conclusions as to the likelihood right now that a fiscal contraction would actually be expansionary if I'm willing to go so far out on a limb, since I'm not a person who likes people afterwards to tell me that I am wrong. So that's the argument against the policies being adopted in Europe and Britain right now. It's simply that the channels through which this is supposed to work. You cut government purchases, you see sharp reductions in interest rates, and that makes investment boom. You cut government purchases, and that makes people confident that inflation won't rise, and so the Federal Reserve doesn't have to keep unemployment as high in order to keep wages from rising rapidly. Those channels simply aren't there. And without those channels, it's not at all clear how this argument is supposed to work. But this kind of won't be true forever. It's true now, but there will come a time when the economy will return to normal, and then unemployment will decline to normal levels, and then output will return to its long-term growth trend, and interest rates on U.S. government bonds will return to their normal values as long. And then the argument that other things being equal, you want a low deficit, a government surplus to crowd in investment, then that's an argument that will have force. And then the argument that you want your government's finances to be sound in the long run, that you want there to be a clear path by which the government is going to raise the taxes in order to pay for the spending it's promised. Because if you don't have that, it will be rational to fear that the government will start printing money and there'll be an outburst of big inflation. Then the idea that you want to have a government that has a plan for dealing with its long-term deficit, with its finances, also has powerful forces as well. So let's call this date when the economy returns to normal 2015. What will the world look like in 2015? What are the U.S. federal government's current plans for spending and for taxing over the long run? And here by long run, we mean long run. Here we mean the next 75 years is the long run. And that's a long time. Right? 75 years ago was 1935. It was the middle of the Great Depression. Adolf Hitler was barely in power. I don't even think Adolf Hitler had banned marriage between non-Jewish Germans and Jewish Germans back then. He hadn't even sent his troops to reoccupy the Rhineland, the demilitarized zone between France and Germany that had been established after World War I. You couldn't have predicted anything about the world of 2010 successfully from the world of 1935. Similarly, predicting what the world's like in 2085 now is a very hazardous game. Things will be very different. They might be better, they might be worse, they'll certainly be different. So think of this as just a central case if there are no big surprises and if things continue to work as they've been working in the United States over the past 30 years or so. So in any event, this graph tells us what the 3 components of government primary spending are. Primary spending means it doesn't include interest on the debt. Why doesn't it include interest on the debt? Because interest on the debt is not something the government gets to choose. The government has its debt, it owes its bonds, it has to reissue the bonds when they come due. The interest rate the government has to pay on its debt is something the market chooses, something the people who buy government bonds choose. It's not something the government controls. But by and large, you can say there are the other components of spending. And you can say that if revenues, if taxes are equal to all of the other components of spending, then the remaining interest on the debt won't be that big a burden on the economy because we have a growing economy. And we then look back at 2010 at what the levels of spending and taxes in the U.S. economy have been. And what we see is that in 1970 we start out with spending at something like 18% of GDP. By the high Reagan years of the mid-1980s, spending has risen to 21% of GDP. You wouldn't say, Ronald Reagan, big spender, or maybe you would if he was governor of California. But yes, Ronald Reagan was a big spender in large part because he had a bunch of people working for him in the late 1970s who thought the United States was losing the Cold War and so needed to double its military budget. And so we doubled our military budget, only a few years before the Soviet Union that the military budget was aimed at collapsed completely. And ever since then, I've been trying to figure out what to do with all the tanks that we had positioned in Germany to resist the incursions of the Red Army into Western Europe. And also what happens between 1970 and 1985 is we see Social Security spending growing as a bunch of people turn 65 and start collecting their Social Security benefits. Then between the mid-1980s and 2000, we see a fairly steep reduction in U.S. spending in the U.S. government, a little bit under Reagan, and a very little bit under George H.W. Bush, under the Reagan second term and under George H.W. Bush, and then a huge reduction in federal spending under Clinton as a share of GDP, with spending falling from 18.5% of GDP down to something like 16% of GDP in 2000, along with an increase in revenues. That is, Clinton raised tax rates, and revenues grew a bunch. Reagan lowered tax rates, here, say, and revenues shrank and did not recover, which then brought us to 2000 and the election of 2000, at which George W. Bush said taxes are too high. And unclear why he said spending was too low. He didn't say spending was too low during his election campaign, but given the budgets adopted by his Republican Congress as it turned out to be. And the Clinton administration surpluses went away remarkably quickly. And then that brings us up to today, when we have this sudden fall in revenues as a result of the recession, and this big rise in spending here as a result of the recession, as we try to cushion the effect of the recession on America. But then by 2015 or so, we're projected to get back to normal. What's going to be the new normal in 2015? Well, other government spending is going to be more or less back to its late Clinton year kind of levels. Social Security is going to be a little bit bigger than its late Clinton era levels. Add those up together, and they're maybe 1.5 percentage points of GDP higher than they were in the late 1990s. And all of a sudden, there's this other category, Medicare, Medicaid, CHIP, and exchange subsidy spending, that's going to be relatively big. That's going to be up at, call it 6.2% of GDP in 2015, while it was, all in all, something like 3% of GDP back in 1993 when the Clinton administration proposed its healthcare reform, and I worked on that unsuccessful effort. So the big thing to change between the early 1990s and 2015 will be this growth in federal government healthcare spending from about 3% of GDP, from about $1 in every 33 that the government that is spent in the country, to 6.5%, to about $1 in every 415 of what we do. Yeah. Okay. The Affordable Care Act of 2010. Or actually, there are two things. That this is the baseline, which projects that the laws governing taxes and spending stay what they are now. And there are two big pieces of the law, a tax code provision called the alternative minimum tax, and then also a tax on high-cost health plans that produce this fairly steep rise from 2015 on. And then after 2015, the Congressional Budget Office proposes that the rest of what the government is going to do is likely to very slowly decline over time, and Social Security spending is likely to stay the same share of GDP over time from now going forward, and U.S. government spending on healthcare is going to balloon mightily. So much so that come 2085, it's going to be 31% minus 13%. That something like 18 out of every $100 spent in the United States in 2085 will be spent by the government and will be spent on healthcare, as opposed to $3 out of every 100 spent on Medicare and Medicaid back in the early 1990s. And this is the optimistic picture. This is the picture that assumes that the laws governing taxes and spending remain the same. There's also what the Congressional Budget Office calls the alternative scenario. And the alternative scenario observes that, say, back whenever taxes seem to rise above 20%, of national product, either when they get close to that in the early 1980s or get above that in 2000, people tend to cut taxes. And so says that we're going to have taxes at about 19% of GDP forever, that that's what Congress is likely to do. And it also says that the current law projections assume that a body called the Independent Payment Authorization Board will make a bunch of recommendations on how to reform Medicare pricing, how to reform how much the government pays doctors and hospitals about Medicare. We've taken a look at past laws to reform Medicare pricing in the past, and we've seen that Congress has been pretty eager to repeal them whenever they hit doctors and hospitals and pharmaceutical companies in the pocketbook too much. We don't think government spending is going to be 30% of GDP in 2085. We think it's going to be nearly 35%. And that produces this huge, enormous gap. Starting soon after 2015 and growing much larger to amount to 5% of GDP between 2030, between what the government taxes and what it spends on programs, let alone what it spends on interest. And this is our problem. Right? This is our long-term problem. This is the thing that makes people worry that at any moment, investors, businesses, and households may say that the United States government's long-term finances are broken. It has no plan to keep the promises it's made about healthcare spending and also the promises it's made about keeping taxes low. At some point, the U.S. government is going to start printing money, and then we're going to be headed down the road toward a Zimbabwe-land inflation experience. We better start insuring ourselves against that now. And indeed, that large deficit scenario isn't going to come true automatically. It requires that Congress do a bunch of things to bust the budget, right, over the next 10, 20, 30 years. If Congress doesn't, or if Congress doesn't, the president doesn't sign them, the kind of depressing alternative scenario doesn't come true. Then again, Obama talks about his late 2010 extension of the Bush tax cuts as an accomplishment now. And that's the kind of thing the Congressional Budget Office is talking about when it talks about this alternative fiscal scenario in which American government